great to be back at the Ransomware Summit. So both me and my colleague Maximilian are analysts for the DFIR report. We're going to be covering the evolution of ransomware tactics in 2023. So we're going to be looking at some of the key trends and developments in ransomware attacks that we've seen in the last year. The bottom line is ransomware attacks are still ongoing, despite improvements in detection and response and actions by law enforcement, such as takedowns and so on. So we're going to be looking at a lot of the cases and attacks that we saw in 2023, leading into this part of the year as well. So we're going to be covering C2 frameworks, the use of tooling and how these have evolved. There's still a lot of common techniques, but there's definitely been a shift in new techniques and how they're using C2 tools. And then we'll start to cover lateral movement and use of the tunnels. So we started seeing these several years ago in one or two cases, but now we're seeing them quite frequently. Then we're going to be covering the attacker tooling, both living off the land and also customized tooling. So we're seeing a marked increase in those as well. So obviously a bit of time by the attackers have been spent in creating customized tools to meet their objectives. And then we'll look at some interesting evasion techniques that we've seen. And finally, one of my favorites is hands-on hacking by threat actors, including offset mistakes and what they do once on the console, on the endpoint. So just a bit of background about the DFIR report. So we develop, utilize some incredible sources to track threat actor activity, provide some unique insights. So we can't go into detail about our sources and how we do it. These are TLP red, but a lot of the content that we're covering in the slides are TLP clear. So this last year, it's been incredibly busy. We've observed thousands of C2 servers by various threat actors, and we've tracked 40 different malware families, and we published a lot of reports in the public domain in the past year. We also have a number of private reports. Some of these are small, don't cover the full end-to-end, but are very valuable. We've also been credited by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in their CTO report on TrueBot. And we've contributed to the micro-attack enterprise as well. So we've had a contribution recorded on that. And we've also been recognized for a CVE. So the CVE shows 2021. So just a bit of background on that. There was a proof of concept that was developed in 2021, but we saw an exploitation of that in the last year. And the way the CVE works, it goes back on when the vulnerability proof of concept was actually done. So that was why it's recorded as 2021. Not to mention, we've contributed to a lot of detections, Sigma, IGS based as well. So it's been a very busy year. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, and he will talk about a bit more about the common access vectors.
Thank you, Pete. So this year at the DFIR report, we noticed that for initial access, social engineering remains the most common initial access vector. Over the last year, the DFIR report has observed that most intrusions were caused either through the CEO poisoning, so search engine optimization, or through phishing. The CEO poisoning, so continued deployment of bootloader, so that one is typically characterized by its JavaScript payloads embedded in zip archives. But we also saw that, while not being actual malware, remote monitoring and management tools were commonly deployed as well. So the increase of RMM usage in intrusions is, in our opinion, a direct consequence of the fact that it's really adversary friendly. The infrastructure is legitimate, so law enforcement is not really going to take those down. The tools are legitimate, so that decrease the risks of the initial detection. So antivirus vendors might not always flag your RMM tool. And then most importantly, the RMM offers a GUI-based remote access, so that it really lowers the entry bar to crime. Another common initial access vector was phishing. So even though it's an old technique, its effectiveness really remains unchallenged. That's something that pretty much everyone in the industry still observes. There's still a lot of phishing incidents. Over the last year, the DFIR report, we documented quite some phishing incidents where initial access was then brokered, so sold on through the larger ecosystem. So for the C2 framework trends, as we mentioned, that indeed access typically gets brokered. Well, these intrusions where access is brokered, so they typically occur, for example, through ICE ID or TrueBot or other malware that's well known to perform initial access. And once the access is brokered, the malware deploys an additional C2 framework. And there we can notice, for example, here in the schema, we can notice the real drastic change in infrastructure. So this is from one of our cases where we saw that ICE ID C2 really completely shut down in the environment as soon as Cobalt Strike started to be deployed. Well, initial access is a continuous game of cat and mouse between the industry and the criminals. So we always see new ways of obfuscating the initial payloads, the initial malicious documents, and so on. The follow-on C2 frameworks are less dynamic. So most intrusions we observed ultimately employed command and control tools that have been well documented for the last few years. This offers the detection opportunity because, well, most intrusions result in well-known C2 frameworks. And here it really indicates the importance to defend against these known tools. Over the last year, we noticed that most of the employed C2 frameworks were Cobalt Strike, Sliver, and Metasploit. So these all together, these three frameworks account for over 98% of the C2 infrastructure. One small caveat, these statistics suffer from the survivorship bias, so we don't track the unknown, so there's definitely more out there. Another technique that was quite heavily employed this year was tunnels. So tunneling traffic remained a high priority for recon and lateral movement. Some examples of malware that deploy tunneling was system BC. The main advantage of deploying a tunneling technique is that it provides the adversary with same LAN access, so a bit as if the adversary had their computer plugged in your LAN. And from there, they can start doing the typical lateral movement, network scans, and brute forcing. For the detection opportunities with this one, well, we typically recommend to hunt for baseline variation. So these include just uncommon patterns such as local host authentication, so network authentication, but where the remote IP is local host. Also hunt for default host names in your logs. Definitely the amount of cases where we see that the adversary's connection originates from a desktop computer or a Win computer, probably above 50%. And then also uncommon processes accessing privileged ports. So for example, here in the screenshot, we see that PowerShell is accessing the RDP port. That's definitely not something that you would expect in your regular environment. While tunneling traffic remains a priority for recon and lateral movement, in the networking category, we also had some special winners this year. Namely, RDP tunneling remains quite heavily employed. And then for me, it was the first time that I noticed it this year. We also saw some SSH-backed tunneling. So obviously, you don't change a winning team. Here, quite important, the detection opportunity. We really recommend you to run an IDS or IPS at your network choke point. So something that organizations typically avoid to do because they have the false impression that it requires a lot of storage for the PCAPs and so on. That's not necessarily true. You can run an IDS or an IPS without actually storing the PCAP it's better to know that you might have something going on in your environment without having the ability to validate the detection than just missing the detection as a whole. Throughout this year, we also noticed, as Pete mentioned, a couple of custom tools. I'll be presenting here the NBR killer tool. So it was quite surprising. It was one of the first cases that we had where destruction was attempted instead of extortion. So here the actor deployed an ANSYS script, so a nullsoft scriptable install system, which is capable of wiping a device's master boot record, master file table, volume boot record, extended boot records, and afterwards forces a reboot to render the device inoperable. How these typically work, while ransomware typically encrypts your file and then requires you to pay for the decryption, this actually just destroys a few blocks on your disks, which actually loses your data. Your data is still on disk, but your machine has no clue on how to locate that actual data. Quite interestingly, this malware, the source code that we actually recovered from it is similar to the 2018 attack on the Banco de Chile. Here, defense-wise, well, detection, it's too late, but there are quite some defense mechanisms that you can employ to avoid this. So most importantly, the Windows Defender's controlled folder access features actually blocks or can block direct disk access, so the raw disk access, which is what was employed in this case. Another advantage of the ANSYS script is that it can serve as a proxy. So while we inspected here the source code, we saw that it's actually just a wrapper around the regular legitimate Windows API calls, but it's just being invoked from an ANSYS script. Here, one special thing related to this approach is that making direct system calls from the ANSYS script actually relies on the ANSYS system plugin, which is being dropped on disk in order to properly function. This offers a detection opportunity. So in our repository of Sigma rules that we published with the DFIR report, we published one that covers the extraction of that system DLL into the temporary directory. Noteworthy is that obviously some legitimate tooling relies on this approach as well. So if you have a Razor Chroma or a Apple Secure executable in your environment, you might see this behavior as well. Another particularity of that NBR killer tool is that it actually modifies the ANSYS header to hinder extractor. So this is a file type masquerading approach. You can see here on the screenshot from the right how the official ANSYS specification mentions a couple different hexadecimal signatures which are leveraged to identify the start of the script. And in our case, the actor actually modified 1 byte to make sure that tools such as 7-zip are unable to recover the original script. The Banco de Chile sample, which we managed to grab from VirusTotal, also had that exact same pattern, so another byte was changed. Quite importantly here, what makes a tool special might make it unique for signatures. So in our repository of Fiara signatures, we published a YAR rule which actually hunts for ANSYS scripts with tempered headers. This is something that we ran a bit on VirusTotal. I think we had not a single false positive. The amount of dirt that you can catch with such a simple rule is quite funny and impressive. For the next custom tool, I'll hand the word back to Peter.
Thank you. So in most of our cases, threat actors tend to use freely available tools to achieve their objectives or just live off the land. So most custom developments tend to focus on initial access or ransomware components. Occasionally, we do see custom tools that are used part of an intrusion. So once they've established a foothold and they're trying to move across a compromised environment. Last year, we observed a NIM compiled Windows binary that was dropped on a compromised endpoint. We named this Nimble Door. So the use of NIM is interesting. because NIM is a programming language that compiles to C, C++, or JavaScript across multiple platforms. It's one of the newer programming languages that is more challenging to reverse engineer due to lack of tooling support or knowledge of how the constructs are compiled. In addition, some AVs struggle to detect malicious NIM binaries, so we suspect the threat actor used NIM for these reasons. This particular tool, its goal was to facilitate the creation of a backdoor account on a target. This could be a local or remote endpoint within the network. It's designed to provide persistence and allows lateral movement for the attacker. Static analysis of the binary indicates that there's some code reuse, and it's based on SMB EXE, and it's derived from InPacket. So InPacket is maintained by Fortra, the same entity behind Cobalt Strike. There are symbol references that is identical to the source code. You can see the left, the binary making references to a lot of the NIM components. So it's possible to identify the source code on GitHub, though in this tool, the threat actor did make some adjustments by adding a command to create a hard-coded account called local end. So the tool utilizes pass the hash against a target account and then creates a hard-coded backdoor account with a hard-coded password that the attacker knows. So in terms of operation, it's quite simple. It's command line based. You pass it the IP address of the target, the domain, the username, and then the hash of that compromised user account. And to fully utilize this tool, though, the attacker would need to undertake some discovery, collection of compromised accounts to determine these parameters. This tool isn't a one-click. It won't discover that for you. So the tool has several key components, internal functions that helps us understand the dependencies and potentially how we can detect this behavior. So that we know the tool is based on SMB exec. So understanding its internal operation would allow us to detect all variation of the software, regardless if it's compiled in NIM or using Python scripts. So rather than just detecting a tool. Interestingly, the tool has a debug output built in, which is very helpful because you can actually see the functions being called, and it shows the sequence of activities as well. So the very first stage, it generates a random Windows service, and you can see the name here. There's a function for developing that random service, and then it's connected to via SMB. Then there's some safety checks for validating account access. And you can see like successfully logged on messages. And then there's a issuing a command to create the backdoor account by the random service using an SMB command. And then there's a number of broker handshaking events going on, whether it's create requests, sending requests, binding RBC ports, and so on. And then the check access is the same as the source code, even down to the output message. Then finally there's a cleanup where the service is deleted, connection terminated, but then by that point the account has been created. So that we understand the functionality of the tool, we can start to look at detection opportunities. So one of the key parameters that's needed is a valid account, along with the NTLM hash. So as I said before, the tool can't do that. But typically, we've seen attackers use Mimikat or variations of it. So they collect the user account by that means, and then once that's been collected, they can pass that as a parameter. And but detecting that, we can look for logon events, again using Windows security logs, and then we can look for service creation events. And then finally, we can start to look at account activity. And again, there's a number of Windows security event IDs that show that the user account's been created, enabled, attempt to reset the password, and it's been added to the security group. And it's all there in the detail, but we can go into a little bit more detail to and look at other detections. So the service creation is 7045. And then we can see a command using net user, which is a hard-coded account, and you can see it, the service file name. So again, very suspicious behavior would warrant further analysis. Then there's a case where the tools was observed being dropped and then executed. The attacker actually failed to utilize the tool. So there's several reasons behind that. So the account the attacker used didn't appear to have access to the target. So without the correct privileged account, it couldn't create a service, then it couldn't create the backdoor account. So it wasn't possible to log on. So from a defensive perspective, segregation of accounts and separation on the network is a really good preventative measure. Would break a lot of lateral movement against privileged accounts. Secondly, having the incorrect parameters, account name or correct hash or even the wrong parameter name caused an application crash, and it was an unhandled exception, and it wasn't clear what the error was. So even as an analyst, when we saw it, we weren't really sure whether it was a faulty payload or tool, and it was quite tricky to debug. And then when we looked at the tool in a lab environment and recreated those conditions, then we started to understand what was happening. So we suspect that the attacker was probably an operator and wasn't the developer of the tool, so he was unaware to troubleshoot. So, but it's clear that the attackers are taking time out to research and develop and create their own custom tooling. So moving on from custom tools to hands-on activities. So some of the highlights that we've seen this past year include the threat actor checking the endpoint for triggered AV alerts. So not just the AV configuration, actually seeing any alerts being fired. So AV logs can provide a wealth of information, so it should be monitored. So the attacker could have tricked something, and it could have been an easy win for the defender. So on the AVs, we've seen the attacker bringing script for tampering with security tools, and we see that quite often, but we also saw the attacker bringing a tool for enabling the security tool. They never used a script, but they did bring it in. So again, one theory is that they could be looking to blend in, do their action on that target, and then re-enable everything, so not to trigger any alerts. In another instance, the attacker created a group policy object and then tried to push out an update across all the endpoints. Due to an error on the attacker's behalf, this failed, but again, it's quite unique how they were looking to push out malicious configurations and malware. And then we saw an unusual exploitation of Windows services where they removed a registry key, and this triggered the Windows service to default to full privileges of that calling process. It's a documented feature in Microsoft. Again, not something that we've seen routinely. Then, going back to tools, we see a lot of third-party tools. So we saw SoftPerfect being brought into the environment. So SoftPerfect is used for network scanning and network surveying. So what was interesting, when the attacker brought in the tooling, they also brought in the SoftPerfect configuration file. And it was quite clear that that SoftPerfect configuration file has been used in other compromises, because we could see other victims in that config. So it's a bit like a saved history type thing. Process hacker, we've seen this being used for troubleshooting and process dumping. Notepad++, we've seen those used for troubleshooting scripts when they're on the endpoint. And IOBit unlocker, so this one is a new one. So an attacker used this to remove a file lock that was locked by the system process. So the attacker was working with a file, it got locked, so they brought in this tool to unlock it, and then they could carry on working with the file. So FileZilla, we've seen that being used extensively for exfiltration. Snap2 HTML is another new tool. So they use this for enumerating file folders to create a nice HTML GUI-based report. So a bit more about SoftPerfect. So it's a feature pack tool, and it's a network scanner, WMI. It's got a lot of things built in. So in this case, the attacker dropped the SoftPerfect binary installer. They also dropped their playbook, which is like a how-to guide in select form, and then a key generator to crack and unlock the full feature of soft perfect. So here's a snippet of their playbook. I've translated the image into English form. So the key generator is usually flagged by AVs due to poor reputation. Sometimes they can be Trojanized. So the attacker took a big risk here. Other hands-on activity. So as in the past year and in previous years, we see offset mistakes when conducting hands-on activities. These are fairly common and something we see every year. So these can be mistakes of a C2 framework, putting shell in the host command line rather than the C2 framework. Typos. Here we can see in one case the threat actor mistyping some of the parameters. So there's a misspell, and then they use British English for behavior monitoring rather than American English. We've also seen crashes where there's been faulty payloads injected into privileged processes. And then, as Maxime mentioned, exposure of the attacker infrastructure through tunnels, revealing their host name. So what do we recommend you do? A lot of it's been covered in previous presentations today. So enable audit login, especially for privileged accounts. Consider the use of honey tokens. So you can also set up like decoy accounts, and if you don't have access to those, you can trigger alerts. There's a really good blog where someone analysed one of our cases by ThinkSST, and they went through how you could use deception technology. AV logs, try to monitor those. It's a quick win. Testing, Red Canary is great for that. It helps validate controls, what your gaps are. Is your security tooling working? Is your audit logging in place? And then understand your environment. The attacker, they spend a lot of time doing that discovery, so you should be able to do that as well. And then understand where your gaps are. Importantly, detect early. The sooner you can detect it, then you can work out what your response is. And then prepare for an incident. You know, do we have the skilled analysts? Have we got the playbooks in place? Do we know to isolate those endpoints? There's a lot of fantastic resources out there and a lot of training resources. And it's, yeah, there's a wealth of material. So lastly, a big thanks to the DFIR crew for publishing and sharing insights into the intrusions we've mentioned in this presentation. And not to mention to the Ransomware Summit organisers putting on a great event.